Well, let's get started. About a word of prayer, and then we'll dive back into the grace and families. Gracious God, we give you thanks this day for beautiful weather, for a nice celebration of our admin coordinator, and we ask for your blessing as she and her husband move to Washington. We thank you for your word and your sacrament that gives us all you have to give, holding nothing back. And we thank you for a chance to meet together and discuss how you work in our lives at home. And we pray for your grace in our family life. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
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 Okay, so just a little bit of catching up to speed. We've done 2 weeks introducing Grace in Practice by Paul Zoll. And then we did a third week, which was last week, on Grace in Family Life. And we spent the first part of the hour on grace in singleness. And Paul Zoll is, of course, talking about unmarried people, but he's also saying we are all single individuals. I mean, we enter this life and we exit this life pretty much individually. And even when we're married, we are single individuals who've merged into a marriage. Before God, we each of us stand before our Maker. Individual members of the body of Christ. So we talked, a few people shared about singleness in the church, what that can be like, how sometimes one of the graces necessary is to make sure we're not defining normal as nuclear family with a married couple and kids and so forth. It also means we give special attention to singleness that comes through divorce, through death, and being widowed, and just other forms of singleness. We also then moved into marriage, talked about marriage quite a while, and we'll do a little bit more on that today. One of the things we learned from Paul Zoll's book is that being known in weakness is the origin of marriage. And so his contention is that marriage depends on having a theology of the cross, not a theology of glory. The wedding planner has a theology of glory. The reception is an occasion of glory, and it should be, that's fine. But the marriage is under the sign of the cross. You have pledged your life for your beloved, and that's, again, in good times and in want, and for rich or for poorer, and so forth. And so Paul Zoll talks a lot about how law and grace play out in marriage, and it plays into a lot of things. We talked about the mythology of marriage, that we sort of have this soulmate myth that nobody could actually live up to, that we all bring into marriage, different kinds of baggage, different kinds of what he calls insistent archaeology, on which our previous life stands. And law and grace are kind of both at play in the competition of married life. And grace helps us to say that grace is helpful to say we are both at fault in our marriage, because the fault is in our chemistry and in our heads, and we're all under the power of sin. So we depend upon a real gracious understanding of ourselves and then of our spouse all the more.
Did we lose you?
No, I'm just
Oh,
looking to see
okay.
if I summarize the things that I wanted to summarize. Now let's kind of talk about marriage at a couple of transitions, and one is the transition as kids leave the home. So grace for when children leave home, and many of you have been through this, and I have not. But he talks about grace in two parts when children leave the home. He talks about grace shows us that our marriage is in a new kind of glare that reveals the cracks in the foundation. The lights were shining on the kids and the need to take care of the kids. And it's not like kids turn 18 and move out and they don't need you anymore. That's not true either. But all of a sudden it's like, hey, we're the only people in this house. who, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm your husband. How are we doing? So one is just that new kind of glare as the light shifts from raising kids to revealing the cracks in the foundation. And then the second one is also, I think, really, I'm interested to hear what you have to share, as the case may be. Second piece is that grace helps us to admit our forlornness that we might be experiencing, because we're each grieving our children moving out, but we're also kind of failing to respond to each other lovingly as we grieve this big change in the family. But the other piece I think that is kind of interesting, it's not quite so easy, is that in this new glare, revealing the cracks in the marriage perhaps, but also then understanding the forlornness of just simply missing our kids. But the other piece that he highlights is perhaps our love has been improperly weighted toward the children. And so then them moving out, sort of, it's like the mobile is out of balance. And all of a sudden it's like the improper weighting of attention and love towards the kids. Now it's shifting, and that's quite a shock. So let me just stop talking now and see how any of this might be hitting you and what you've experienced or what you've seen.
Well, there's a new reality out there, and I'm watching it happen in my own family where kids don't always have the option of moving out as quickly as they used to because of debt, because of low wages, no matter whether you have a degree or not, and simply the inability to support yourself without numerous roommates. And so it makes it difficult for kids to move on, number one, and it makes it difficult for parents to move on. And my family has done very well under these circumstances, and I'm very, very pleased with their ability to adapt. But it isn't as easy as saying, okay, go out there and get yourself a job and do your thing. It's just not. You can't just desert your children and say, do it anyway, because it's just not always possible.
So how might grace and law play into that? Like, what does grace have to teach us in caring for our adult children who still quite practically need our help?
Learning to live together interdependently, learning to respect each other, give each other the grace that is necessary, and not depending on one another for the very things, all my grandkids are very good at cleaning the house and cooking the meals and taking turns at all the things that have to be done.
I think the hard transition is you're changing from them being your kids, where you're the authority figure, to them being adults. And where you have to change the whole dynamic and say, if you want my advice, ask for it and I'll give it. If you're not, then I will bite my tongue and not tell you what I think you should do, unless you're doing something really, really bad. I think that's probably part of it.
Yeah, kind of need a new law in the relationship, but it's not going to work out unless there's grace that fills that.
Well, I've heard from my friends, it's even harder when they've moved out and then they have to move back. That makes it really difficult.
Yeah, if you could hear Sandy talking about kids moving out, but then they move back. So there was a gap there, and then coming back. Welcome, Jackie. Yeah, it's interesting, and Judy, it was good to highlight the change, just the sociological change nowadays, what is required to be able to live independently or even with one or two roommates. And and if marriage and other things are pushed back to a later age as well, it's not like you're even teaming up with at least one person early on. livable wages, all the rest. I mean, rental prices right now, all of that is just, it's just nuts. And like you mentioned, student debt too.
There used to be some statistics on that. I'm sure they're different now, but there was a time when 19 was considered the age of emergence, and that was more, and now the last statistic I looked at, which was probably 7 years ago, that was moved to 26, was the age of emergence, which means independence. However, those ages were always lower in poverty or low income areas because the age of move out was much younger and the age of independence was much younger than with those whose needs move on for education, etc. I just thought I found that interesting because my husband is 10 years older than I, and so he was raised with one set of expectations and I another. And part of that was when you were going to move out and what independence meant.
Yeah.
I found the empty nest page kind of interesting. Maybe I just was, but as my children left, I was just starting to be responsible to help take care of my parents. My dad had passed away and my mother was alone, and I kind of was able to focus on her. And then I guess I was lucky again. She passed away. I found out 2 months later that I was having grandchildren. I do think God's kind of designed our life to kind of, the priorities change. I felt like there was always a job there, or something to keep me involved and to where I could dedicate my time to without having to not be there for my kids or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, one of the big changes that's going to happen eventually is that when our kids don't get married or move on until they're almost 30 sometimes, or have children by then there's going to be a time in their future life when their kids are still with them and their parents are in need. And that's going to be a huge change in the dynamic of family life for people in their late 20s right now.
Yeah. We're resetting the clock to 18 more years at least with children in the home. So
yeah,
Linda's got to keep it up till 90. My mother-in-law up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Linda, just move in with them.
Yeah, we've got I just built a 4th bunk bed for you. Yeah.
Back when I was in my 50s and my working comrades all were too, we were known as the sandwich generation. Because we had children, we were still either in college or high school and keeping them going, and our parents were failing and we were keeping them going. And believe me, those are meatless sandwiches.
That's funny.
Yeah.
I just got that.
Well, let me introduce a few of my favorite parts from what he has to say about grace with children, because this all weaves together. You know, it's not like we go through in order. We're talking about aging parents. We're talking about adult children who come back. So just a few things that he has to say about grace with children, and then we'll jump around again. We all know the hardest part about being a parent is you have to be Moses to your kids. I mean, you've got to teach them right and wrong, or they're going to hurt themselves and each other. You have to be Moses. And so the challenge is always, well, then how do you also be Christ for your children when you're trying to be the law? How do you also communicate grace? That's a constant dynamic that is very difficult. Sometimes it breaks down when one parent becomes the law parent and the other parent becomes the grace parent, and that creates an issue in the marriage, of course. And you know, and children learn, you know, like we all do. Anytime God gives us a law, we figure out the loopholes, and children figure out how to do that at home too. Which parent to go to for which issue, what law applied to my older sibling that maybe doesn't apply to me. we don't do these things maliciously, but we do these things kind of naturally. And so one of the things that the author wants to emphasize is, even though parent and child is dominant in law, it has to be dominant in grace. So the way he says it is this: if law is absorbed with mother's milk, the mother will lose the child. If grace is the mother's milk, then the child will return gladly to the mother. And that's the challenge is, how do you rear little children from grace rather than law? Because the law is our best bet with little ones. The little children require the law. And so how do you raise kids from grace when they need the law so bad? And he gives us three things at least. He says grace works with little children in three ways. One is it's the law of boundaries, not the law of condemnation or guilt. So you talk about boundaries for a healthy life, but you don't do it in a way that then causes neurotic feelings in a child who's, screwing up. And you might know this, but they play this game with you. So if I tell one of my kids to not do something, then they've learned to say, I'm just stupid. I'm a dumb kid. They kind of try to make it a condemnation of the identity. And they're playing that. And you have to be really careful that what you say is a boundary for the good of life together, but is not a condemnation or something that just puts neurotic feelings into a child. That's kind of the first piece, is thinking about boundaries as opposed to condemnation. The second one is grace is utterly alive or barrenly dead in relation to the father and mother's marriage. If marriage lives from a one-way love, and a reminder, by one-way love, that's a good thing. That doesn't mean one person loves the other and the other person doesn't respond. For him, one-way love means each person in the marriage is going toward the other without waiting for the other to earn it or something. So if marriage lives from one-way love, the rearing of children becomes graceful, because the law that squeezes love improperly out of the child as compensation and consolation is inactive. He says that in a fancy way, so let me restate it after I let Hannah in here. Okay. That a marriage of one-way gracious love, it allows children to be loved not as compensation for what is lacking in the marriage, but as an outpouring of the grace that's in the marriage. And that when we aren't getting from our spouse what we need, or when we know we're not giving our spouse what they need, the temptation is to compensate with our kids' love and to console ourselves with how much our kids need us and love us. That is a strong temptation.
And that will make
a neurotic kid. That's right. What he says exactly is the result of this for the child will be defeatedness or a hurried departure at age 18. Yeah. And then the last thing he says, the third one, is mercy as opposed to judging is still the change agent, even in the lives of small children. It's still grace that actually produces change, not judgment.
Well, let's say you got a young kid.
Yep.
So they'll be home by 6 o'clock. Or,
yeah.
Or say, if you're home by 6, I'll give you $1. Well, for 6-year-old kids, $1 is a lot of money.
Yeah.
Say the kid gets older, you have to raise it up to $50 to get home by 8.
Yeah.
Then they learn that there's you do this, you do that, be home this or you a lot of them get punished. They learn what power is more than love.
Sure.
So now you have this powerful parent, and if this consistently works this way, kids are growing up wanting to have power.
Yeah.
That's one way.
Sure.
Many years ago, I taught a class on boundaries. What was that guy's name? He's written so many books.
Henry Cloud.
Yeah. And they're still really good books. I mean, if you pay attention, and, you know, boundaries are important for any relationship. It doesn't matter whether it's marriages or parents or children or whatever. It is the idea that you are that individual person who has requirements, and you have to respect the requirements of the other individual persons in your life. And you come up with ways in which you can do that in a productive way. And, you know, it's very valuable information for people that don't know how to say no, that don't know how to say no, especially you can't always interfere in another person's life. You have to let people make decisions on their own and then figure out how you're going to live with those decisions together. You know, I just felt that those classes were very, very valuable and helpful for anybody, no matter what relationships you're in.
Oh, good. Well, each of these comments introduce some things that teenagers present to parents. Sorry, Gray, as the representative teen in the room, but you're light years ahead of your peers, so it's okay. Is that grace with teenagers? Now we begin to get the boundary pushing. Well, there's always boundary pushing, but it takes a new shape, right? So, you know, some of Paul Zoll's advice is, I mean, some of it is sort of stereotypical. So he's going to talk about the mother and father's roles, and, you know, of course, that doesn't apply to every family situation, but we can take his advice and sort of see. He says, you know, the mother is all important for the graceful lives of little children. And the father's role during that period is gracefully to support the mother. And then he says the father is all important for the graceful lives of stormy adolescents, both boys and girls. And the mother's role is to help keep the father present to their children. The role of the father for teenagers is to embody grace by simply not leaving. The father must stay involved emotionally and not detachedly in the tempestuous emotions of his teenage children. And here's the one line to remember. The children, they are begging you to leave so that you will stay. Teenagers are begging you to leave so that you will stay. And the deep magic of the law says, tough love. Kids need tough love. And the deeper magic of grace will tame that wild beast of adolescence. He says, on the surface, adolescents are asking for the law precisely so they can break it. At a deeper level, adolescents are asking for grace again and again so they can return to the love that always gives thanks.
When my two boys were like 8 or 10 or something like that, and they fought like little devils and they drove me crazy, and I got some wonderful advice from a wise friend to just walk away. And so when they got in a fight, I would simply walk out the door and I'd say, if you get in trouble, call 911. I'll be back in a half an hour. And guess what? They stopped fighting, and they weren't fighting when I got home because they were so concerned that I wasn't going to come back. And as they got older, I did go places where I didn't come back for a week. And I said, you're on your own, guys. Talk to your dad.
What age can I start that?
Oh, I'd say 12.
I took a number of parenting courses, and one in particular, I had 6 teenagers at once and really buried myself in some help at that time. And I remember we would work over, what are the rules now? I mean, because when they were little, the rules are, you know, you stay on this street and, you know, those things. And I can still remember my last set of rules as these children were progressing through their teenage years. I still remember them. My rule 1 was, let me know where you are. Rule 2 was, call me if you need anything. And rule 3 is don't get arrested. And I know those sound small, but it put it all on them, because eventually it wasn't on me anyway, except that let me know where you are. And that was kind of, I'm here for you. And that was call me if you need help. And that's I'm really here and I will rescue. And third was don't get arrested. It's on you. I mean, it's really on you. But I watched those rules change, from don't do this to don't do this, to stay here, to here's some guidance, to finally just, those were posted on the refrigerator at the very end.
Yeah.
My favorite comment from Mike after he was an adult was, I said, "What, Mike, why didn't you get in real trouble?" He said, "Because I knew there were consequences at home." And so there is something about the law, but also knowing that you were there.
Well,
You planned on coming home.
that was what I meant by don't get arrested, which was if
Yeah.
it's illegal, don't do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not my rules anymore. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what,
Nice and loud, Jack, please.
prisons have a code of conduct.
Uh-huh.
That's one of the protections. Of course, there's hours or certain people in prisons. And schools have that code of conduct. There's street people. I went to college with a graduate school with a guy from a big city. And a big school. And if they were gonna go solve these problems in the courtyard, so to speak, they'd be there all day long. So they left the children, almost adults, solve their own problems. It's the only way they found to keep their sanity.
Okay, let's keep going. Grace and grandchildren. I like this section, so listen up. The ones who need grace the most from the grandparents is not their grandchildren. It is their children, now raising children of their own, who draw down upon themselves judgment. Grace in the case of grandchildren should be grace in the care of your adult children who have demanding lives. Now, that's one of the things I appreciate about Linda, if I can brag on her for a little bit, is that we know she's there if we need her. We know you're there. And we also know you sometimes feel like even if you're coming over to our house to paint furniture and to help us, you also are like, I hope I'm not here too much. I hope I'm not imposing. It's like you feel bad for being around or something, but we know that you'll help us out if we really, really need it. And even though the great fun I've heard that grandparenting is of course, you don't have to be Moses anymore. You can be fun and send them home hopped up on sugar and off you go. And that's all a great benefit. But it's also a challenge to give grace to your children as they parent and to see what demands they're living under.
Mom and Anna in the middle.
Oh yeah, Robert, did you want to share something?
I'm in a weird situation where I got divorced 5 years ago, and so I really haven't had any contact with my daughter since then. It just turned out bad. Yeah. And I finally now that she's an adult, we've reached out and we've been able to talk to each other, but I'm not a authority parent or anything like that. I have to tread lightly, and so it's a weird relationship. Maybe it's better for me because I didn't have to go from the do it because I told you to do to you're an independent. It's more of a more casual relationship, and I'm hoping that I can get it back together at some point where we can spend time together, because right now we haven't gotten together or anything like that. So it's a weird, different situation. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping every day that I'm doing it the right way and not messing things up. So
sure,
that's all I had.
No, thank you for sharing that, and God's blessing on that repairing relationship. That's really an incredible opportunity as it may go. And I think you understand too that if it comes to grace and law, the law is not going to produce the relationship that you want with your daughter.
No.
It's going to be grace, and it's hard because we do want to help and to make sure that they're getting their, moving their lives to get forward in a good way. But grace is the answer. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
And grace for yourself too, because there's no end to the introspection on what you could do differently. You'll never find that comfort in the law.
I'm always going to be second guessing, probably.
Yeah.
I'd have done this, so I'd have done that kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's also the situation where grandparents are raising their children.
Yeah.
And raising mom, I mean, the law, in most situations, that's pretty big part, because the law says you raise your child. The grandparents, by grace, are willing to raise the child, but it's never, stories I hear, never in secret situations. It does require a lot.
Yeah. Carol's talking about grandparents raising children. If you can hear that.
Can I just say something about grace?
Of course. Yes, Jackie.
About grace for yourself as a parent.
Mhm.
Also, my daughter, some of you know, she's very challenging. She recently moved home after being in a group home environment for 7 years. And I'm finding that I am again to make a list of the things that I do right. I've done that throughout her life, just giving myself grace. Oh, I didn't handle this right, or I said the wrong thing, or whatever. And just to get that list out every now and then. Say, you're doing the best you can. Because I think as parents, and maybe this is more for mommies, is we just tend to put a lot of pressure on ourselves, want to do it right, and we think, oh, we yelled at our child one time, and they're going to remember that for the rest of their life, and I think of their rods or whatever.
We do remember the rest of our lives.
What's that?
We do remember the rest of our lives.
Well, that's what I thought. So thank you for confirming.
We just say, we will not do that again.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just think it's really important that we not put their hard stuff too.
Mhm. Oh, that's really good. Thank you. Yeah. Grace with aging parents. We talked about this a little bit earlier, the sandwich generation and such. He does talk about how grace produces the new birth that you need. There needs to be the death of the child as a child in relationship to their parents, and the birth of a fellow adult in relation to other older adults. So it's more marked by friendship and maturity than sort of what he calls the old neurotic strain within the relationship must be cut out. And the law is not going to do that. It's going to require grace. So that the grace of God involves the birth of the adult who is no longer the child who can love you from love and not from need. That also reminds me, I didn't cover any of what he said in terms of grace in marriage as you age, which that's probably a whole other hour. But
here's the microphone.
yeah, but again, too, what does grace look like as your spouse ages, as they are over? We've been talking about free will and unfree will and compassion that's produced from knowing our bondage to sin and other kinds of problems. But as we age, it becomes all the more clear just how we're out of control. We're dependent on the grace of good health, or we see the loss of it outside of what we want. And this can go in very challenging, of course, and heart-wrenching ways with marriages that have dementia coming into the picture, and as well as any number of other basic needs. Just like grace with our own aging parents, grace with our aging spouses, which usually includes ourselves as aging spouses, and that's a real season in life for grace to shine, because the law is just bearing down. The law of mortality, all the law of regret of all the things you did or didn't do in your life. And grace is just ready to go. Jack.
Our culture is kind of changed things around too, because the woman was mother, was usually always in the home, and now they're more out working for two reasons. One, they need the job. Two, the person feels to be going to be more supportive financially or whatever. And their kids to have more things. And then we have all these split families. So they're being raised by two different families. So they're with this one week, this one the other week. So they have opposing things working. Situation.
Yeah.
So a lot of
I have a great grace and law story.
Yes.
My mom was in her 80s. She was living at Solvang, and Dale and I decided to take a 3-week vacation to Hawaii. And so I left Dennis and Mike in charge of my mom. And their relationship with my mom was always grace-filled. They spent wonderful times and had lovely conversations. And we were gone for 3 weeks, and she got very sick while we were gone. And the grace was that they never called me once during that time. The law was that when we got home, they both came to me and says, never leave the house again. So, it was a whole new experience for them to adapt to caring for someone that much in their lives. And, and we all need to prepare for that to some degree, but it was not pleasant to be left with the total responsibility for another person when they had never had that experience. So maybe we need to share more often.
Sure. Jack says he remembers how happy you were those 3 weeks in Hawaii.
Yes, we were with Jack and Carol, and I don't know whether Jack was that happy. I don't know, was it?
It was a new sensation.
Yeah. Being with Jack is always an experience, period.
Okay, we've made it to the last category. And by the way, next week next week will be so much easier. We'll talk about grace in public life. Grace in society. I mean, that should be no problem. Okay. The last category is grace with siblings. Paul Zoll says, almost all sibling problems have to do with a child feeling that the affection of his parents was unevenly distributed. Grace demolishes the idea of proportional loving. It demolishes it first from the standpoint of God. He also says, I'm not hesitant to say that the grace of Christ is the first stage of healing for siblings who are furious at one another. As a reminder, this author's been a pastor for 40 plus years. He says, I have seen reconciliation effected only when one or the other of the injured has become a Christian. It is a strong statement, but necessary to make. In some sectors of human brokenness, grace as a mediated expression of the grace of Christ, in the cases of sibling hatred, the only solution is for one of the better parties, whether victim or sinned against, to be so undone by the word of the cross that the reaching out becomes unforced. When there is not such an interposition of a new life, there will be just one more lonely funeral with separated mourners or absent children. That's a pretty dark thing to say, and y'all have a lot of families like this. But there is something in there that as grace and law play out in our marriages and in our raising of children, the children are being shaped by that. And even despite our best intentions as parents, children have a way of telling a story, partly true, partly untrue, that mom or dad was always more gracious with my sibling, or more interested in my siblings' activities or something. And of course, there's dynamics of firstborn and middle child and lastborn and all of that. And you know, we all have to kind of come into maturity and come into adulthood and wrestle with how our family shaped us and what are we thankful for and what do we say, like Gray, you said, well, I'm never going to do that. You know, you said, you know, you never forget what your parents said, but you also say, let's not do that again. Yeah. And so I can recall all the things I was not going to do as a parent that I've since done over and over again. And siblings are on their own tracks. And so you come to maturity in different ways. You come to a relationship with your parents as adults at different speeds, in different ways. And that can produce a lot of ongoing sibling kind of in graciousness. So anything we want to share about grace with siblings, the particular difficulties of that, because it's not parents or kids. You can actually move on without any contact with siblings. And you think that, you know, sometimes it's harder to see. I think what he's saying is without the cross of Christ, it becomes really hard to actually say, I do want this person back in my life. You know, and something hard has to happen to make that take place. Jackie.
Yeah, I'm the oldest of five. So of course, I'm the bossy big sister, and my sister underneath me is the spoiled little princess. But I think one thing that helped within my sibling relationships is just having some deep, kind of difficult conversations about our childhood and how we experienced it, because I found that I have much more understanding just to know where they were at. And it's hard, you know, those difficult conversations can be hard. I guess that's why they're called difficult. And just how, you know, how they experience something one way and we experience it another way. And all of us kids have tried to do that. I don't know, it's just been really nice. Not more than understanding what was going on with them. Because, you know, when you're a kid, you're kind of in your own world and it's all about me. And
I didn't have a brother, but I tell you that my older friend, my best friend, could be almost my age or maybe a year or two older, was like my brother. I spent a lot of time with him. I got to listen to him. What they did, what they wanted me to do, or all that stuff. So it was a close relationship going up, and it lasted a lifetime. I've been doing this stuff and having David. I lost a dear friend here a couple weeks ago. It was my hometown. I was 2 years old. We went to college together, and he became a minister. And, we just talked to him here a while back, and he got pneumonia. 2 weeks later, he was like dead from leukemia, just like that. And but it was really his little loss. Of course, was a good friend of college. He's got Parkinson's, and another good friend of mine in college, and a roommate, he's got Parkinson's too. He's got Parkinson's, and his wife had so I'm feeling a little bit of that. That these people are suffering. I'm not so much. What's on your mind?
Yeah, thank you.
I have a great story too, and that my sister has always insisted that I was I was my father's favorite. But she insists the last couple weeks of his life that he admitted that out loud, and I don't remember hearing that. But then she laughs and says, "That wasn't your fault."
Yeah.
That's grace. Don't blame your siblings. Yeah. Even if you thought one parent liked you better than the other, which I don't think is true. They just were so much alike that they knocked heads a lot. But she actually said, "But that wasn't your fault." And you can't control how your parents do that. So grace is looking past that with siblings, you know.
You know, I listened really carefully when you were reading that from Zoll, that I think in some ways, sibling relationships are in some ways deeper than almost any other relationship you have, sometimes because of trauma, sometimes because of, you know, things that have happened in your childhood. And I have a sister that was born when I was 16, and I have not seen her except for a few moments at my mother's funeral for almost 20 years. And I don't expect to see her again. My brother and I have done just about everything we can think of to try to somehow repair that relationship. But we both at 79 and 80 years old are not particularly positive about that coming about. And sometimes, and that's what I mean about the deepest kinds of relationships, because sometimes you just have to let it go.
Yeah, Zoll calls it the last wall of Jericho to come tumbling down.
Yeah.
Sibling rivalry.
Yeah. And my brother and I had very little to do with her raising. I mean, we were both off to college and married before she was in elementary school. So it's.
I got along with most of my siblings as a child. They were older than me, but related to my marriage, my relationship with my closest sister who lives here in Eugene broke like 13 years ago. Well, no, it wasn't 13. It was 18 years ago. But we finally started fixing it actually around the divorce time. And it's not the same as it would have been if we hadn't had that break, because it was very bad. It was no contact kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's gotten a lot better. And each of us, I think, have given the other grace, and it's slowly healing. Maybe by the time we're in our 80s, it'll be completely better.
Yeah. No, grace is on the move in your life, Robert.
There are whole dimensions, though, that because the children I raised, it was a blended family, it was a step family. There's a whole dimensions that aren't always familiar to others.
Yeah.
When you encounter marriages and divorces or husbands that have passed or those kinds of things, it's very, sibling relationships can be very, very complicated.
Yeah.
Mine was a mixed as well, because my dad had 2 kids, my mom had a kid, and then each of their spouses passed away, and they ended up getting married, and then I was the last one. So I thought it was like the Brady Bunch when I was a kid, but there were undercurrents and stuff like that I didn't realize until I was older. It's weird. Yeah.
I think humor has its place in some of these things. My youngest brother, he's 12 years younger than me, and he definitely, I'll tell you, mom and dad, he was like the prince. He could do nothing wrong. In fact, as for older kids, we joke, there's one whole bedroom. Well, there was until they moved into the living. There was all of his stuff. He went to West Point, and you know, he's a good athlete. I mean, everything. No pictures of all of us, you know. So, and that's fine. We joke about it, and he jokes about it too. And I think it's actually good for our own well-being, just to be able to joke about it, because, like you say, I mean, he can't help it. I mean, mom and dad just thought the world of him. And I, as the firstborn too, I had that role for 2 years until my brother came along. Anyway, it's just humor, I think, has its place. Help you survive.
Yeah, right. We're just about at noon. Any kind of last things we want to gather up before we call it a day?
I think that one of my my brother's relationship is that we were both homeschooled, meaning that we were with each other all the time. So when we were younger, we used to but as we got older, I think I was really getting moving. And when we finally started ironing things out, and we really started we still have some arguments, but it sounds one really, really big argument every year or so. As opposed to every
Yeah.
progress. Yeah, progress is an idea.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great that you could forge that. Yeah. Good. All right. So we're going to get outside of the home next week and talk about society. And if you're brave, come back. And we'll talk about grace and society. If you find grace in society, let me know so we have something to talk about. And then
Yes.
we'll come back.
I was
All
going
right.
to tell you that I got news today from Suzanne
Uh-huh.
that their son Josh and Jackie had their first baby last night at 11:30, and it's a girl. Her name is
Carol?
Quinn Nicole. Maybe you got
Okay.
the message. I don't know.
No.
Quinn Nicole. Anyway, she's 5 pounds 13 ounces.
All right.
Yeah. So she's
good.
been there since Wednesday night at the hospital. So they've had
Oh,
some
fun.
difficulties.
Shanna Olson's got a
Yeah.
grandchild coming
Anyways,
this week.
Oh, wow.
Shanna Olson.
Oh, good. All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Have a good day.